Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here and thanks for checking out my podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell for new episodes. You can also find Shine Without Shame on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. My guest today is Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers. Dr. Tina Sellers is a nationally known speaker, author, and researcher on religious sexual shame. She is a professor emerita of sexuality and marriage and family therapy and serves on the board of the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. As a preeminent voice on purity culture and Hebrew Mystic Sexuality, Dr. Sellers is frequently featured on podcasts, TV, documentaries, articles, and radio, including Spirituality and Health Magazine and NPR's All Things Considered. In her acclaimed 2017 book, Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, Erasing Shame from Sexual Intimacy, Dr. Sellers reveals how the Western conservative church, in collusion with consumer-driven culture and politics, has infiltrated our core ability to attach to our partners and instruct our children to attach to theirs. Her latest book, June 2023, Shameless Parenting, Everything You Need to Raise Shame-Free, Confident Kids and Heal Your Shame Too, was a new release bestseller in 8 categories. She speaks throughout the world on how to heal and how to raise shame-free, relationally confident children. She can also be followed on Instagram at Dr. Tina Shameless, also at NW Institute on Intimacy, or tinaschermersellers.com. Thank you so much, Dr. Sellers, for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tiffany. I'm so glad to be here.
Yes, good. It is going to be an interesting conversation, I think. I am curious about your work and your perspective on the subject of shame and in the context of sexuality and intimacy. I'll share that I started this podcast a few years ago. Well, I started it because it was during the pandemic and I wanted to have rich conversations, not necessarily about the things that were going on in particular in the world, but it was just a desire to connect more, of course, because most of us were a little isolated. So I started to think about what topic was of interest to me. And I was thinking about reflecting on the idea of shame and why it is so prevalent for so many people. Individually, but also in the culture. And I'm sure that's kind of a universal culture around the world. But I just wanted to explore this topic and also promote the idea of shame not being something I believe to be helpful. You know, it's this idea of not feeling good enough, not feeling worthy, feeling like you're bad, and having that come about through experiences and maybe even painful ones, and not maybe always having a place or an opportunity to let that go or to explore a little deeper why we feel shame and where it came from and how we can release it. So that was the idea of the podcast, was to explore that. Also, the flip side of that, of the topic, is my thought on the idea of shining without shame. So being our best selves and not feeling bad about shining our light, and the idea that if everybody can find their way of shining their light, there's no need for competition or comparing or feeling that other people need to dim their light so we can feel good about ourselves or about our contributions. So that's the history of the podcast. And then today we find ourselves here with your background and interest in shame. And I know you've written some books about the topic with a specific focus. I'm just curious why this work for you. How did you get involved, and what keeps you invested in researching and exploring and helping people deal with their shame and hopefully healing?
Yeah, I love that question. I kind of backed into it. I didn't march straight into it. I had an academic position in a marriage and family therapy program teaching graduate students. And my focus at the time was in an area called medical family therapy, which looks at the impact of illnesses on people's lives and how that is and is not being attended to and how we deliver healthcare in the United States. So I did a lot of teaching of physicians on what we would call bedside manner. And I trained therapists to go into outpatient medical settings and work alongside doctors to deal with the psychosocial impacts of their life and how that was affecting their health and so on and so forth. Excuse me. But along the way, I had been also teaching the graduate level human sexuality class, which is a required course for licensure in the state of Washington, which is where I live. And one of the assignments I gave my students was to write their sexual autobiography. And usually when I tell people that, they're like, whoa, I can't imagine ever committing that to paper, right? But if you're training therapists, you want them to know what their stories are, where they begin and end, so that they don't get them confused with the clients that they're sitting with, the patients that they're sitting with, right? And our sexual story in the United States is not usually a very cohesive narrative. Most people did not get sex education. All that they got from TV, movies, videos, media, and then from their friends. And I've, circled the United States talking about this for years now. And I would say 90 to 95% of people grow up in homes that are largely silent or silent and shaming around natural sexual development and all that we need to learn to understand how to do relationships and relationship with our own bodies, in some kind of way that allows us to thrive. So I had been reading these for years. I started teaching the class in 1992. And around the year 2000, I noticed a dramatic shift in the tone and quality and focus of these stories. So while the stories were remaining very similar, the way the students described thinking about themselves in the story what became dramatically different. So they described themselves as being perverted, something was wrong with them, they didn't want anybody to know, they were sure that they were bad. They, and yet, so there was this combination of both thinking so horribly about themselves that was increasing, while also an increase in naivete about what was normal development, like common curiosities, common expressions, common feelings, common thoughts, and because that hadn't really changed, but how they felt about themselves had. And it was heartbreaking to me. Like I would literally, these papers could be anywhere from 10 to 30 pages long. And I would cry through them because I thought, oh, baby, you aren't supposed to feel this way about yourself. You are precious. Like this is all common, sweetheart, And I would just be like, feeling so much. And I didn't know what I was seeing at first. It took a couple of years. I started to ask more questions of both my students and my clients. And I began to realize this was by this point about mid 1990s. I was hitting the first wave of students that had gotten abstinence only education in their schooling, because that started in 1980. And then for some, they were also involved in conservative religious communities growing up, either in their home or they were in a youth group or something. And they were getting messages that was saying that we had withdrawn all research in sexuality. We switched what we were teaching. We were no longer teaching anatomy, physiology, reproduction, a place for kids to ask questions. We were now teaching abstinence only education, which was 80% medically inaccurate. We know that now. It was just scaring them. And it was basically religious education in disguise. And so students were told, don't think about this, don't want it, don't do it. And if you do, you will put your life in danger. And if there was a more overt religious component, you'll put your future relationship with God in danger and your first future relationship with anybody else in danger. And so these kids who were starting to hear this at 9, 10, 11 really believed they should be able to squash all of these natural feelings, thoughts, desires, whatever. And of course they couldn't. That's like asking a child to stop breathing. So they just went inside and began to shame them. Now, I think one thing that's really important to know, and I've come to believe really strongly, that in America, if you grow up in a home that is silent or silent and shaming, and then don't get actual sex education, your very first shame that you experience very likely is a sexual shame. And we know that because between the ages of 10 months and a year, a child's going to realize that they have access over their hands, right? That they can move their hands, reach for something, all of that, right? Instead of whacking themselves in the face or whatever they do. So around that time, somewhere in there, around a year old, a child in the middle of getting their diaper changed or being in the tub, they're going to find their genitals. And this is going to be a glorious day for them because it's an area of our body with incredible nerve responsiveness, right? We have more nerves in that area than probably any other small area in our body. So child is going to be like, wow, this is great, right? In their little nonverbal self, right? But if there is an adult or a caregiver by who thinks that's nasty, dirty, yucky, bad, whatever, and slaps their hands away, yells at them or whatever, the child's only internal response is something must be wrong with me because I don't know what I did, right? They were doing something very natural to their development. And we have to understand that a child is going to keep doing that age, a year old, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It's not until they're about 5 that they're going to really lock in the memory. I better not do that in front of my parents, right? And so it will have happened hundreds of times, but that's pre-verbal or not in a memory that is easily held onto after our brain does all this pruning around the age of 11. We usually are remembering back to about age 5 or so if our memory is pretty good. So we know that kids were getting a ton of this and it was deeply rooted inside of them. And then it just got layered on top by abstinence only education or other kinds of things being said by the loved ones in their lives, right? And so it's a deeply rooted feeling. And what I noticed in my students who were a lot of them in their 20s, early 30s, was that they were having pelvic pain, they were having erectile dysfunction, they were having these symptoms just like somebody who had been sexually abused, right? They thought horribly about themselves. They felt like it all was their fault. They were a deeply wounded person, right? A deeply hurt person, and a bad person, a bad seed, right? And so this was so disturbing to me because that was not my background. A lot of people think, well, was this your background? It wasn't. I grew up in a Swedish immigrant home, and there had been generations of body positivity and sex positivity. So I just learned about your body and sexuality like you learn about brushing your teeth and recipes with your grandma. And I just learned along the way all the things, right? So anyway, that's why I think for me it was so stark, was because of this contrast. And so that led me down the path of doing research, writing, speaking, all kinds of things. And it became the new focus of my career. I kept the other stuff going, but I've been doing it so long. It was like, I got to understand this. I got to understand this. And then I got to say, we need to stop this. We are hurting people's ability to do attachment, deep, meaningful attachment later in life. Yeah. So that's how I got into it.
Fascinating that it was essentially through the voices of your students over time. Mm-hmm. And the evolution or the change in, like you said, the tone and the attitudes that they were expressing about themselves and their bodies and their feelings about their bodies. And that's fascinating. I mean, I'm sure that's for many researchers. For some researchers, that is how they discover, mm-hmm. information and new ideas. But I think for you, that's so interesting. It's so organic to your everyday work. It wasn't like you had a specific question about this, like, oh, what is there a cultural shift or is there a change? You were literally reading it and witnessing it. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And that's part of why I say I backed myself into it, mm-hmm. because it was really seeing this outcome and then going, whoa, what happened? And what's the history? And, and the next thing you know, I'm writing a book taking on the conservative Church of the United States and talking about what the evolution had been and what were the outcomes right now, and that was not at all what I said I wanted to do, but it became so urgent for me, because it does make a huge qualitative difference in how people experience their lives and joy and thriving, the things that we usually really hope for people.
Right. And I'm thinking back to when I was in school. I went to a private school for 13 years, well, two schools, but for the first 13 years. And it was certainly more conservative and religious in nature. And there was abstinence in the grade school years. There was abstinence talk. Although it was interesting, there was abstinence talk, but then in 8th grade, and we did the Julie story for the girls in their, learning about their period or whatever that video was called. And I still to this day don't know what the boys did. I think they just stayed back in the classroom and they got their lecture. But it was interesting. There was also in 8th grade an opportunity. I don't know how this came about, but an opportunity for our class to ask a parent questions. Now we wrote down questions about sex and sexuality, like put them in a hat kind of situation.
Yes.
And this teacher answered questions. And now that I think back, I'm so surprised that was allowed, but somehow that obviously came to the table as something that would be useful, or at least someone thought that would be helpful. And it was fascinating because we asked questions that weren't the typical, like, how does my body work, but asked questions about, sex and relationships. And not that I at all thought this was promoting, like, okay, go have sex. It wasn't that was the message, but it was just an opportunity to ask and not feel shamed. Of course, our names were not attached to the questions, but there was a freedom there to at least be comfortable and be in a space where questions were permitted. And I do find that that was it made me personally feel like, okay, it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to be curious. It doesn't mean that then you need to go and experiment. I'm sure there were kids who did experiment with sex, but for me, that wasn't like the path that I was on. It was just like, let me just learn about this. This is what adults are always kind of alluding to, or in movies and television. This is something that I know like people are doing, but I don't know where else to ask these questions. So I'm just reflecting on that experience, which I don't know if that was necessarily unique. I find it unique given the environment that I was in, because it was religious and it was conservative, and there was the abstinence message.
Sure. Yeah. I actually taught junior high at a private school. And what I know about private schools is you have a little bit more freedom depending on what your headmaster or your, administrator says as a teacher. So I bet you, because we had that too. I mean, I don't know. I taught in the mid 80s at a private school for junior high, and I got to have a question box. I got to design the sexuality training. So we had a little bit more freedom there because it was a private school. So probably you had somebody there that was like, it would be good for our kids to be able to ask questions of someone. So I'm so grateful for that for you.
I think I look back and I think, okay, yeah, that was a layer of stifling that we didn't have put on us. I mean, there was still the message of abstinence, and that's something I wanted to ask you about, because I was in grade school in the 80s, and then the AIDS epidemic came about. So there was just a lot of factors that I imagine were going into the messaging around health and sexuality.
Yeah.
And there also, now I don't know the stats, you would, I'm sure, there was the teenage pregnancy factor that I believe I imagine was contributing to this abstinence message. I mean, yes, if you're talking about the context of religion or religious institution or environment, of course that makes sense, because that is usually a teaching or a law that is kind of promoted, not to have sex before marriage. But in terms of teenage pregnancy, is it true that that was at its highest, at least what was recorded in like the 80s and 90s? Or can you tell me how though that phenomenon was potentially influencing the messaging? And I'm not saying you're promoting or you're agreeing with that abstinence only messaging, but I'm just trying to kind of put some pieces together in the puzzle as to what was influencing the culture during those times. Does that make sense?
It does. And it's an important question, because I think understanding our history helps us not repeat what we don't want to repeat, right? So as you said, in the 80s, there were a series of things that happened that made the public frightened. Okay, we had second wave feminism, we had an economic downturn, and we had AIDS hit the East Coast in 80 and the West Coast in 85. Okay. This provided an opportunity for those people in political power to take the fear of the public and really do what basically make a story about that and then do whatever they wanted with that story. So where there were some things that happened, abstinence education became one of it. What we know now is the places that still teach abstinence education, and we've now got tons of research on this, shows they have the highest teen pregnancy rates. Okay. Because we're not giving them anything except for what the media is giving them. Right. We have this long held idea, and I can hear it a little bit in your talking, that if you teach children around sexuality, they're going to go do it. But in fact, it's the opposite. Sexuality is the only area we don't provide education, and think of education as being protective. It's like saying to your kid, you're not driving a car now. You will be able to drive a car when you're 16. It's dangerous. It's fun, but it's dangerous. We're not going to give you any information on it. And at 16, we hand them keys and we say, you are free to go drive on the freeway. Okay. It is unsafe for them to not have learned things along the way that were age appropriate. Like, you get in the car, you get in your car seat. We put a seatbelt on. We wear seatbelts because blah, 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 blah. We teach them that at 3. Right? We have things we teach kids about cars and driving, and then they get more detailed information when they hit 14, 15, 16 years old, right? So that when we do hand them keys, they are safe, right? So sexual education, relationship education is the one thing we withdraw. So we had some things going that really allowed the public to be kind of putty in the hands of what was happening sociopolitically. This is the same time that the religious right and the moral majority crawled into the Republican Party and made some significant changes. Now, on the outside, they kept talking about family values, but in the backside, what they were doing were things like removing regulations from the FCC, so the Federal Communication Commission. We removed regulations to protect the family, or to protect people about what was on TV and movies and so on and so forth, beginning in 1985. So now all of a sudden we can put as much misogynistic information on TV. We can actually lie in journalism, right? There was no regulations at all. Well, then we had the influx of video games starting, and we had music videos, and then we had the internet. All of those things followed that same misogynistic, like violence against women, we know dramatically increased beginning in the late 70s. And it has continued since then. It has now shaped a generation of people who think women really are disposable, right? And people are disposable. And that's because we have no regulations at all. We also, at the same time, removed regulations on the banks. Then we saw where that led us, right? Beginning in 2008, right? So what was really happening behind the veil of family values was a push on capitalism, where it was no longer that the means, how we do something, justifies what we get as a result. I always say to people, I still have the frying pan of my parents when they got married in 1958. Like, we built quality things because the means justified the ends. Beginning in 1980, the ends justified the means. It didn't matter what you did, only that you made your shareholders money at the end of the quarter. So we began removing these regulations that we had on federal communication and on the banks, right? And we had switched an ethic came in, and this came in with Reagan, and it continued. And we began to change the way we did our tax structure, even, and what people were taxed on and what they weren't. We began making corporations people, right? So there were these big things that just kept on happening. And so we went from an income gap, right, from our wealthiest to our probably middle income person that was probably around 40% difference, something like that, to now 3,000% difference, where we are now in the United States. So we have been at this now for 43 years, and it has changed the nature of our country in ways where we not only did not repair the problems that we had prior to 1980, but we now have built on top of those problems. And we are in a worse situation now than we were then. And so a lot of times people want to look at this stuff and see it in a smaller window. But I think it's really important to see it in the broader window, because it shaped our entire structure in our country in lots of ways. And it has disadvantaged people even more than they already were. And now we're really struggling, right, as a country. Meanwhile, we've affected our climate, et cetera, right? So at the core, people are trying, I think, to have really good relationships. But when you have put all of this on top of them and then shamed them, made them feel like nothing about them is good enough, then their ability to thrive, to do good relationships, to have relationships that make them happy, to even have emotional intelligence, all gets affected. But then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the benefit to capitalism if people are not functioning as well? Are they more pawns? I mean, what then happens? Because I think that's part of where we are. And so, yeah, so we started delivering abstinence education, and we started to see people, increase in STI rates, an increase in teen pregnancy rates. AIDS ended up having a mediating effect, because we did start to roll out, once we understood AIDS better, we started to roll out education. And I remember how that began to change kids. They became frightened, right? And so they became themselves more interested in things like contraception and how was it transmitted and understanding things better, right? Because it was a huge tragedy across this country, the amount of people that we lost in the 80s and early 90s, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that more than anything affected teen pregnancy rates, and just kids being not having information. They went to find the information. I can remember talking to some of my students. I was teaching in graduate school at that point, but I'd kept in touch with a bunch of my students, and they were like, yeah, I'm dating, and everyone I know is using condoms. Everyone I know we're scared to death. And I'm like, well, baby, I bet you are. I would be too out there. We're still learning about this whole thing, right? So I think that more than anything affected teen pregnancy rates, because what the research shows around abstinence education is those states that are still very conservative, they have the highest teen pregnancy rate. And they also have the highest rates according to Pornhub too. Everything's underground there, right? Sexuality is underground.
That is interesting. And when you speak to people either in groups, or do you do individual counseling still?
I do what's called clinical supervision. So I have like 50 people across the country who I help them with their cases. That's okay. And most of them are adding sexuality to their learning set of things they do.
Okay. So when you do think about, because I know your work is also focused on families, helping children become comfortable and happy and thriving in their lives in general, but also through their body, through their health, through their sexualities, but or their relationship to their body and sexuality. What is important in your mind in terms of promoting or educating people about, and families about, teaching kids about sex? In other words, how do you advise people and parents to approach the idea of sex and sexuality, and even for parents, whether they're conservative themselves or they're more open and liberal, I mean, what is your kind of through line to people when it comes to how to talk about sex with their children, and what creates healthy relationships and partnerships and families?
Right. Yeah. I love this question. And really the book Shameless Parenting came about because I had so many people contacting me from the other book and saying, I don't want to do to my kids what was done to me. Can you help me? And I said, absolutely, I got you. I've been teaching this to physicians and therapists for 30 years. I'm happy to put something together so that you feel like somebody's holding your hand, because I know how scary this can feel. But one of the things I try to remind people is, if you have little ones in your life, whether they're your nieces, nephews, or whatever, or whether they're your own, remember how important it was to you to know developmental things. Like, what's this kiddo going to be like the first year or the second year or the third year? What are the tasks they're going to be doing? Like, how can I be ready to support them? Sexuality and body awareness and relationship information is right in there, right? There are things that kids are curious about at different ages, right? So for example, I was saying that they find their genitals somewhere in that first year, right? And by the time they're 2, they know that part of their body and they love that part of their body usually, And so, and for them, it's not masturbation as we think of it for like an adolescent or an adult. It's more like a comfort place in their body where they can receive a sense of comfort, right? It feels good. And so they're reading a book or they're watching TV and their hand is going down in their pants, right? It's just a comfort. Now, it takes a little bit for them to learn, like getting to be 3 or 4, before they start to actually get it. Oh, I need to go to my room, or I go to the bathroom, right? Because this is a private part of your body. It's a wonderful part of your body. But everyone in our family goes to their room or the bathroom if they want to touch that part of their body, kind of a thing. You just give them normal information. So with the book Shameless Parenting, I actually broke it down into birth to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 8, all the way up to age 18. And I'm saying, here's the emotional tasks most kids are trying to accomplish. Here's the behavioral tasks. Here is the sexual or sensual curiosities that are likely to emerge. This is how they're going to emerge. But then I go a step further and I recognize that parents can only give a shameless education to a child if they have been healing their own shame. So I have in every single section, now let's imagine that your child does these things. How does that feel inside your body? Do you find yourself feeling scared or going, oh, I don't know what to do, or whatever? Because if you do, take a deep breath, you're fine. That's just an indicator that you were shamed at that age. That's all. So here are some things to think about. Here are some things to write about, right? And here are some ways to heal your own shame. And then at the end of every section, I say, here are the top books for kids this age and for parents this age, and top websites. So I literally say to parents, you only have to be 2 years ahead of your kids. You don't have to have it all figured out, but you need to be ahead of them a bit and read the books to the kids so that you get that education no one gave you, right? And then read the adult books too. And slowly what you're going to find is you're going to heal. You're going to start to feel empowered, and you're going to enjoy your child's development so much more, not just their walking or their speaking or that book report they did. You're going to enjoy their development and their ability to manage relationships. So when they're little, like grade school, you're teaching them about body autonomy. Your body is your own. It's no one else's. You get to decide how you touch it or who touches it. You can say no. You can even practice saying no to me, right? You teach them about other people's body autonomy. They're in charge of their body. You don't touch it if they say no. If you ask to give them a hug and they say no, you respect that. So you teach all about that. You teach about consent, what consent is. If somebody asks you not to do something, they are giving you information. You need to ask, so you teach them about consent. You teach them about what's kindness. When is someone kind to you? When are you kind to somebody else? What's respect? You're teaching them about relationships. You're teaching them how to solve conflicts, right? How to use their words instead of hitting or whatever, right? This is all under the umbrella of sex and relationship education. In the Northern European countries, they call it life education because it's about some of the best parts of life. We get hung up here because, and I was helping with the Senate hearing here in Washington when we just put in comprehensive sex education that is medically accurate. There are only 17 states in the United States that require medically accurate sex education. That's it. So we are so far behind. But I remember there was somebody giving a talk in front of the Senate saying that this new education was going to teach first graders how to do oral sex. Absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. But again, trying to scare people, right? Because people have learned now, 2 generations later, that you can say whatever you want and people aren't going to check, right? And so people say these outlandish things, and you're like, well, have you read the education? Because it's developmentally appropriate. There's absolutely nothing in here that is not a natural question or a natural response that a child that age typically would be expressing. Yeah. So, yeah, that's where we are with sex education and why it's so important that parents stay on that. I love that they care so much more even now because we got apps and stuff that says this is what your kid's going to do. But understand that sexuality and relationships is equally important. And we have so many fabulous resources now. Like you can go to the library and come home with 20 books just for your 4-year-old or your 6-year-old or your 8-year-old.